Kiali Kenwa Hambio, buenos dias. Welcome to week 4 of New Mexico Literary Landscapes. I hope you all are doing well. I hope you guys are enjoying the content so far. It's always a pleasure to teach this class, like I said before. I also want to thank you guys for sharing. You guys are doing a wonderful job of sharing some pretty cool stuff, sharing some personal interactions, some of your own works. That's great. Um, this week we're going to be diving into that a little bit more, and then the following week we're going to start like really pushing out to where people can share as a class, and so we'll be working focusing on that starting the following week. um and so moving along with what we have scheduled in the syllabus, I think it's important to kind of discuss some of the upcoming uh, uh, components to the class or sections of the class. So we'll be going over and transferring over into like what we think of as mestizaje, that mixing of culture. And then we'll also be diving into really focusing on a lot of that New Mexico based content. Um, uh, that's totally tied to here. So anything from like things like alabados or the old songs of the penitentes to folklore and things like that as well. And so it'll start coming in more. So basically kind of like honing down a little bit, but we'll still talk about things from the outside. I think it's important to keep that perspective embedded within what we're doing here, because it offers us the opportunity to see how there are similarities from different places, different geographical places um, around the world, um, that are similar to what we hear about here in New Mexico. So today we're going to be talking about, or sorry, this week, today for me, I'm going to be talking about resistance, resistance in the form of literature, but also resistance in the form of fighting back, right? Fighting back to be able to keep things intact. And so before we get into that mestizaje, we have to understand this element too, that, and we talked about it before with the ancestors and stuff like that too, but this is a very important part of the dialogue that's shared within New Mexico's literary landscapes and also just New Mexico culture in general. So it's important to discuss these things because I think New Mexico has a very rich history in that idea of resistance and resilience, pride, right? Like I think I told you guys before, like in you're not gonna go to New Hampshire and see someone with a tattoo of the state of New Hampshire on their back of their skull, but you go here to the fair or to like an event in Old Town and you're gonna see one of those vatos with the tattoo of this symbol tattooed on the back of their skull, right? Or we get them on our arms. We have this really great sense of pride here in New Mexico. And a lot of that ties to those ideas of resistance. Like we've chosen to continue to do that, right? Like that's a part of who we are as a people, is these people who are focused on resisting, right? Like we fight a lot in regard to like what we think is right. And so that's an important factor to consider when thinking about New Mexico. I like calling it like Resistance Volume One, Untying Knots. Like it's like a mixtape, right? Um, and the whole thing about it is like it really is because it's always new, right? Like with a mixtape, we're always getting this new content. And so with this idea of resistance, we see it occur multiple ways um across time, right? Across the timeline that New Mexico has as far as its history is concerned, right? And so even early on, we start seeing it. But I want to focus on kind of like a certain time period here because I think it kind of coincides with what we were talking about before with like ancient thought and storytelling and all this stuff. But one thing that we need to consider is that other places had examples of this too, right? And so the indigenous peoples from around the world all have stories of resistance and resilience. And so it's important to discuss those and see how they are similar to the same things that we're seeing here, right? And so I'll discuss that further as I'm going along today. But one thing that's important is to understand that that's a part of it. And so we still continue to do that today, whether it be in like filmmaking, or it be in storytelling, or it be in poetry, or it be in music, or song, right? Like we still continue to see this as a major theme within the content that's brought out of New Mexico, right? Or created here. And so I think it's important to kind of discuss this, not only because of that factor, but because like it's a big part of our history. And to me, those histories and those narratives and those stories, if you will, right, those cuentos, those happenings, right, are part of who we are as New Mexicans. And so whenever I hear a poem or a piece of music that's embedded with that, I can't help but enjoy it, right? It's something that brings something out of me. And I think a part of it is that we share so much in regard to it, even within our querencia, right? Like our querencia, what we talked about before, and I'll talk about it even further later on in more detail when we're getting ready to do our cuentos, right? Digital cuentos at the end, towards the end of the semester. But one thing that's very important about this is like that's part of the place that we feel home, the part of the place where we feel connected, right? And so being Nuevo Mexicanos, we kind of have that embedded within our querencia, or even our lives, right? Even our stories. And so it's easy for us to do this, right? Um, it's easy for us to kind of describe things a certain way. It's easy for us to connect to those old stories. Why? Because like they're so relative in a lot of ways here. And so I think it's important to kind of discuss those, like I said before. So let's talk a little bit about it. So let's talk about resistance and resilience. Where are these examples, right? Who are these people that were examples of this that we saw in indigenous communities across the globe, right? And so there's several. I mean, you're talking from the Maori people in New Zealand and Australia and in the South Pacific, right? Um, to the Zulu people, like there's Shaka Zulu right here, um, in the continent of Africa too, where they resisted against um British colonialism and imperialism, um, as the Zulu people, right? And so we have those examples of that, where we see these individuals who were like, nah, fuck this, I'm gonna fight back. And that was pretty wild because we had seen what they had thought in regard to this is whenever they were spreading empire and participating in colonialism, they thought it was going to be an easy day for them in a lot of ways. And some places it was, but there was a lot of places it wasn't. And so we got to see that happen throughout history too, right? One of my favorite ones that I heard about, and this idea of resistance um goes to the Taino people of the Caribbean, right? Or like places like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, um, Haiti, and places like that, right, where they were occupying those areas. Well, when the Europeans came, um, like in this, it what ends up being Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic, and Haiti they end up killing all of them. Like they wiped out an entire group of people. Like you're talking hundreds of thousands of people were killed, right? Um, but they didn't stop. They didn't resist. Those people fought back the whole time. Fought back in numerous ways. Sometimes it was um actual physical warfare or battles, but other times it was through spreading of knowledge and things like that too. And so that's kind of an interesting theme that we see here. And also the fact that we have these examples um where people will go to the end, right? Even like death, which is wild. Like even like death can't stop them resisting, can't stop their resilience, right? That's how strong they were. That's how they were able to inspire too, right? And so I love sharing this. And this is a quote from or this is the story of Hatui, who is this dude here. who was burned at the stake by the Spanish um, on the island of Hispaniola. And so he was the chief of those people, right? And so before he was burned alive, um, Hatui was asked if he wanted to accept Christianity and go to heaven. And Hatui asked if Spaniards go to heaven, to which the priests said that they do. And Hatui stated, then I'd rather go to hell where I wouldn't have to see such cruel people. And then they killed him. And so that's some like really intense stuff, right? That we hear about from these individuals. And knowing that is like hearing that phrase, like is kind of inspiring, I guess you would say. Like, so it got people riled up, right? And then that he was the main person and he got killed, um, really got people riled up to where they wanted to fight too, right? So we saw that happen. Another one is with Tupac Amaru the second, um, and he brings this out too, uh, with the Inca people, right? And he says, I have acted only against the mentioned abuses and to preserve the peace and well-being of the indigenous mestizo mambos, as well as native-born whites and blacks. I must now prepare for the consequences of these actions. And that was what he stated before he was put to death. And this was written down by chroniclers of the Spanish, right? And so they wrote this down because they wanted to capture his last words, which is pretty common when people are put to death, just like we saw with Hatui, right? And so those were his last words. And so how deep is that, and how much of a form of resistance is that? Even despite being put to death, that's what they have to say. Like they're still like what they did was meaningful, and what they did was worth it to them. And so those are good examples of literary works too, right? Like quotes and things like that are tied to that. And so having those are an important way for us to kind of reconnect and understand how people globally from these indigenous groups were having to deal with this, and how they resisted, right? Well, that same kind of story, the same kind of thing that we're sharing, and I'm sharing here, applied here in New Mexico too. And that was in the form of the Pueblo Revolt, right? And so I'm going to talk about it too, but one of the videos you're going to watch this week is called Frontera uh, um, Revolt on the Rio Grande. Um, it's awesome. It's an animated video. It's around 20 minutes. And it was created here in New Mexico. All the content is with indigenous and Latino or Hispano or Hispanic artists. Um, and it shares the story of the Pueblo Revolt, right? And some of us have learned about, like, we're all of us for here in New Mexico, we learned about it in our New Mexico history classes that are required courses for us, right? But some of us who are out of state maybe have read about it, heard about it. Was the first instance of that we saw a revolt um over here in this region, right? Against the Europeans. And so it's important to kind of understand that like this was something that was important. And I'll talk about it in more detail too, like from my perspective too, because I think that's an important factor to consider whenever we're telling these stories, right? Or sharing this history, if you will, right? um but whenever you watch this film, this little short film, I want you to think about the following things: like what are your general thoughts regarding this? Okay, like what do you consider to be the most important elements of it? And it's funny because it's like they really hone in on like the vernacular of New Mexico. So that's one thing I love. One of my homegirls was that did the voice. Limoquino from is also a part of that. And so there's a lot of people that are well known here as players in this little short film, right? Um, and so what I want you all to think about is like, why was the Pueblo Revolt so important? Like, why did it make a big difference? Like, what did it do? Um, I know that there's like elements to it that are pretty simple, but like there's another thing to it that makes it kind of so significant for us. And then there's like a buildup to it too, which is kind of cool because it was almost like when you hear the story, which I'll share too in a minute from my perspective and what I was taught, right? It was like a buildup, almost like when you hear a song, right? Or even like in a poem where there's this like driving force that's just gaining and gaining and gaining speed, right? It's just like almost to where we're gonna explode, right? And that's what was kind of interesting about it. And so what's up with that buildup and why was it so necessary? And so I want you to think about that while you watch this. So it is fun. Like I said, I hope you all enjoy it. But I'm really stoked and excited like how wonderful that came out when it was released. So let's speak on the Pueblo Revolt, right? And so those of y'all who aren't familiar with it, um it occurred on August 10th, 1680, here in New Mexico, or what is known now as New Mexico. Um, and so what happened is the Spanish were here, um, participating in colonialism by taking resources, um, expanding their empire, acquiring land, all that stuff, spreading the word of God, like we talked about with the three G's before. Um, and so doing that thing, right? But then also, but while they're doing that, they're also bringing the Spanish Inquisition too. And I kind of shared that with you all last time. And so this was like a dark time, and very violent time in New Mexico. So what ended up happening is these individuals from the different indigenous groups here from the 19 different pueblos. I remember we talked about like it was really like over 100 pueblos before. Well, all those people started to resent what was happening, right? Um, they didn't like the changes that were occurring. And then it also affected like this is like the stories I was told about it and why it was significant from indigenous perspective was like us not being allowed to participate in our traditions and practices and ceremony was affecting our people in numerous ways, not only through the conversion to different religion and the stripping of our resources and our land and stuff like that, but it was also affecting us spiritually and also ecologically. The environment changed too, and we can even see the effects of that too when we look at the Rio Grande River now when it's just barely flowing. Um, but that's just the beginning of it, right? Um, even our food, right? Like our foods even are taken from us and taken to different places that weren't there before. And so they become less and less um our food, just our food, right? And so there's things like that. But the most important thing was like I remember hearing this story was like because we weren't allowed to practice our ceremony, there were instances where we were not able to appease the spirits and have them connect with us like we had in the past. There were even experienced droughts and things like that too, right? And we connect that with that. And this happens like in a lot of indigenous groups here in North Central and South America. But here that was a thing, right? And so the abuses and things like that were very abundant. And so our reaction was to try to reconnect, right? And so individuals like my homie here, Pope was from San Juan Pueblo, or what is known as Okeowinge, which is like where my family, um, part of my family is from too. And so he was a spiritual leader, a medicine man, if you will, right? And so seeing all of this occur and seeing how it was affecting the people, Pope kind of spoke up and he got beat down a few times, almost put to death, things like that. And then eventually what he did is he saw an opportunity to try to reconnect. And so what he did is he participated in ceremony, which was illegal. And while he was participating in ceremony, he had a vision. And the vision told him that they needed to purge this area, right? The land of the people of the Spanish. And so he came up with this plan based off of what the spirits told him, right? And so the spirits said to get yucca cordage and tie several knots on it. Each knot will represent one day, right? And then what they'll do is when they'll disperse it to all the different Pueblo groups, right, and indigenous groups here, and every day someone who's in charge of that cordage unties a knot every day, one knot a day, right? And then when all the knots are gone, that's the day they're gonna attack. And in the meantime, they're gonna plan all together. So what Pope does is he arranges for there to be a meeting with the indigenous leaders and medicine men and people of the different Pueblo communities, right, and other indigenous communities too. And so he schedules this secret meeting, right? And the conquistadors would get all fucking drunk at the end of the night, and so they'd pass out. So there was time when they did have opportunities to be able to kind of sneak off and do what they needed to do. So they met over there in what they called San Juan Pueblo, right? And he told them the vision that he had heard from the spirits, right? And so he told them and handed all of them a piece of yucca cordage with knots tied into it, right? And he told them every day we're going to take a knot off. And when all the knots are gone, that's the day we're going to attack. So he says exactly what the spirits told him, and we're going to run them off out of here, and purge them from who we are, right? And so everybody goes back. They also sent runners to different places that couldn't make it, right? People that couldn't make it, so they sent runners even to like the Apache people and the Dene as well. Even the Hopi, right? Like to help out with this. And so these runners ran, like they straight up, there was no horse that they were on, like they straight up ran, like some of them like great distances, right? And they get there and give the cords, explain what's going on. Every day, everybody's unraveling one of the knots, untying one of the knots. And eventually it was the day before when it was supposed to happen, right? And so everyone's like, it's gonna go down tomorrow. And so this meant everybody was gonna fight, not just the men, women, and children. Um, and the children were kind of like more support, right? Like, and this is older children. Most of them were the young ones were hidden, and put with older people and stuff like that. But everybody was expected to be a part of it, right? But it was mostly the men who were fighting. Um, and so what ended up happening, last knot was untied. It was the day, August 10th, they attack, right? They attack from all the different pueblos, um, attacking all the missions, attacking all of the uh haciendas, all that stuff that that was there, all the other buildings. Everybody went into full attack mode. And this happened for a few days. Well, what also happened is like some of the people kind of messed up and like started the not too late. And so they ended up joining in the fight like a day later and stuff like that too. Um, but that was the case. And so their actions, right? What they did was so significant that the Spanish, and one thing I need to say too is like there were Spanish allies too, that the Pueblo people did get along with, and they really didn't try to harm them. It was mostly people who were causing problems and stuff like that too. And like there was also people that just got killed because they were just there too. And like I'm not gonna sugarcoat it and say that it was like, oh, this was a nice battle. It was a battle. And so they fought and ran them off, right? And I remember hearing this really interesting story where the Spanish were moving south, in going almost getting back into Mexico, right? And then the Apache attacked them again. So they got down away from the battles over here in the Pueblo, and then when they got south, they got attacked again by the Apache, right? And so it was a victory, right? Popeye and his uh his homies were successful. They got the Spanish out of there. Um and the goal for Popeye was this purge of everything Spanish. So they wanted to get everything out of there. Well, that was a difficult thing because there was some good stuff that the Spanish brought too, right? Like different kinds of foods or other kinds of livestock, things like that that people enjoyed, and we're like, I don't know if I want to get rid of that. And so this ended up causing problems within the indigenous communities here because they couldn't agree on that part. And so for like 10 years, they kept the Spanish out. And then eventually, um, around 10 years later, the Spanish came back and took over this area. But Popeye's name still lives in our mouths, right? Like it still lives in our memory. We still hear about it. Every August 10th, like there's activities that happen here in New Mexico that are tied to that, right? Uh this hasn't gone away. And so there's these modern examples that still are relevant today, um, of how, I mean, still around today that show us how this is still relevant, right? And so we see it in numerous forms. And so for us to really understand the significance of this, is kind of simple because this is something we still have, right? Like our at the Smithsonian, uh there's different pieces of art that are associated with each state, and ours is a big giant statue of Popeye, right? um Here's some of the art that we see depicted from uh the Pueblo Revolt, where we see people being killed and stuff like that too. We see the fight happening, right? I love how there's like the nopal there too. Like there's nopal there. Um, but yeah, so there's that kind of stuff. We have these artist depictions of it too, where we see the Spaniards and the Pueblo people fighting, right? Um, but like I said, we even see it in a more modern context too. And so like these are all this is a more modern piece of art. I think that one's from the 70s, I believe, 60s or 70s. And this, I actually saw this just recently at the museum of folk art in Santa Fe. And there was this real cool exhibit, and it had like a lot of this kind of stuff there. And I love it because you could see this interesting like uh uh effigy, right? Or this like character or statue, right? Of an indigenous warrior, right? And there he is holding the cordage, right? With all the knots in it. And this one's cool because what the artist did, it was like combining that indigenous style and then the idea of like the Pueblo Revolt and punk rock too. And so punk music is embedded within this as well too. So we see it like in kind of like his dress, and the warriors has a mohawk, right? And we didn't typically have mohawks over here in the pueblos. But yeah, but it was kind of cool, like the artist combined both of them together, right? And so these cool examples of art are like how we can still understand how this was an important factor of like who we are as humans. And so and this is partly due to the fact that we are able to kind of connect in that way, right? Um, here's a there's a really cool artist. He does like comic book style stuff, and so I saw this one. This was over in the Museum of Folk Art, but I've also seen it like at Buffalo Thunder Hotel and Casino. They have some of his art up there, and this is like one of the runners, right? And there he is with the cord again, and then you can see that Mission Church burning in the background, right? And he's running to go spread um the word, if you will. Here's another one of that same artist, showing an example of that, like where that warrior is fighting against the Spanish. I love how he is like he like ganked someone's sword, right? He has someone's sword, and he has his tomahawk or his axe, right? In the mix in the battle. Then we also have like photography now that's more recent, to where we still show this kind of same symbolism and this idea of resistance, and this our example, right, of this through the Pueblo Revolt. This is from a picture from a artist from Taos, New Mexico, and you can see there's Taos Pueblo in the background, and there's the cordage again in his hand, um, symbolic of that time, right? And so that's how significant it is. We see all these pieces of art, um, these other forms, right, that even display this same story, this same narrative, this same piece of history, but in different mediums too, right? From statues to photography. And then we also have, oh, there's the statue of Pope, right? And so there is his that's our statue, that represents us over in the Smithsonian, right? And so it's pretty cool. I love him because like he's built like short and stout, kind of like most of us here. And so it's like a like I love that about it. Like I've seen the statue before, it's great. And you can see him holding the cordage, right? Such a cool thing to have represent us. um, so you're gonna have a couple readings too, and I want to just kind of discuss those a little bit because some of them are really cool because it gives us an account. So one of them is called The Coming of the Spanish and the Pueblo Revolt, and this was like a reading from a Hopi, anonymous Hopi writer. And so they talk about when the Spanish came, the Hopi thought that they were the ones they were looking for, their white brother, the Bahana, their savior. And so we see that kind of similar thing that we saw or heard about kind of with the Aztecas or the Mexica and Mayans. Um, that was kind of an interesting thing too. And this is like about the Pueblo Revolt. The chief at Awatovi sent word by this boy that all the priests would be killed on the fourth day after the full moon. They had no calendar, and that was the best way they had of setting a date in order to make sure that everyone would rise up and do this on the fourth day. That the boy was given a cotton string, or it was really a yucca string with knots in it, and each day he was to untie these knots until they were all out, and that would be the day they for attack. Okay, and so that's what they heard, right, from the anonymous Hopi person. One of the other readings you're going to read about is Invasions by Jimmy Santiago Baca, and it talks about where we see these invasions in different places in New Mexico, where we saw people being purged of their culture, and then why it was so significant that this happened. um I like bringing like this, like Ojo Caliente too, like that was an indigenous space, and then it was purchased privately by a um an American private American citizen, right, that purchased the property and made it into a commercial property. But originally that was supposed to be an indigenous site, right? And we see this with the pueblos, we see this also in different areas around New Mexico where these lands are taken away, and even sacred lands. Um, Modern relevance of the Pueblo Revolt, we still see it today. We saw it in the protests that occurred in 2020, um, in regard to like statues and things like that, like when they cut down the or took down the statues at different places in New Mexico, even here in Old Town, in Albuquerque, where we saw even someone get shot. Just recently too, we heard about that over by in Española too, where there's like these instances of people fighting against this, and really kind of like doing the same thing we saw with uh the individuals who are involved in this in the Pueblo Revolt, but we see it in a more modern context, right? Where we see people are still doing the same thing, like they're still wanting those statues to be gone, Oñate and all these other people, right, who were known to be really, really, really horrible people, um, and not to be honored, right? And that's still that form of resistance. So we're still seeing that happen, right? And it also showcases how resilient of a people we are here in New Mexico. And so that's significant. And so what I want you to do too while you're working on stuff this week and reading and doing your writing and all that good stuff is I want you to really think about the power of the yucca cord. Like that's no joke. Like I've made yucca cord, and it's like yucca cordage is ridiculously strong. Um, like I've pulled some pretty crazy stuff with some yucca cord while I'm out, you know. And I've seen it utilized to where it even is like old pieces of yucca cordage that still hold up. And so when I think about it, like, and when I visualize it, like I always think about the strength that that has too. Not only when it has the knots, but also when it also the raw strength, the actual like strength of the yucca cord, right? And so while thinking about this, it inspired me, right? And so I wrote a poem called Untying Knots that was published too this last year. Um, and so I'd like to share it with you guys. And so I'll read it here. So Untying Knots. The truth they say is told through the actions of those who fought against the evils of this world. The truth is told through the blood that pumps in our veins and the words that leave our lips. It is the stories of our ancestors that remain like glyphs on the sun-baked stones that surround us. But truth be told, the stories are full of pain and the unforgiven actions of those who dared to destroy the sacred. Enough was enough, and the time of imprisonment needed to end, not with words, but rather with violence. Then there was one who saw the vision and was given the precious knowledge needed to slay the beast who was killing the people. It was with his medicine and the power of our ancestors that he was able to empower the people. He took knotted yucca cord and used it like an encoded message relayed from the creator to the warriors who laid like sleeping giants. Every day untying a knot, every day untying a knot, every day untying a knot. As the messengers went through each day and each step on a holy journey with the breath of their ancestors as fuel, making their way to our brothers and sisters living around the big river who now wanted the same thing, the old ways to return. Passing along the message, some even with their last breath, like a story told from the mesas about these are those who slayed monsters before, untying knots, untying knots, untying knots. The ritual that meant life or death to the people of the sun also meant the purge of the ironclad beasts from the sacred lands. Untie the last knot. Today was the day in which the power of the people would be felt like a tornado sweeping away the darkness of colonization. The underdog won that day because the power of 164 years of ridicule, conversion, robbery, and death served as a fuel powering the anti colonial machine. And now, 341 years later, we look back at the Pueblo Revolt as a statement of power and resilience. For the story of Popeye and the indigenous warriors who fought during that time are still on the minds and in the hearts of the people today. So hopefully you know, you can start thinking about stuff like that too, and how it ties into your story and how it ties into our histories here, and how we can be inspired by things like this. We can be inspired by the story that has this yucca cord at its forefront, right? So I want you to think about that this week as you're going through things. Um, I want to also talk about what you need to work on this week too, because that's another important factor, obviously. Um, and so let me go there real quick so we can go over that. Um, so here's the announcement for the week. I posted it there so you can see everything. Obviously this video will be implemented there too, but there's the Frontera video. There's your readings. Here's another poem from Tony Mares, who's a famous poet from here too. And then you're gonna do your assignments. This week you have another kind of, it's not a free write, I call it a focus write. And so you're going to respond to kind of the content that we were sharing this week in the videos and stuff like that, and try to connect it to this idea of like power and resistance, right? Like how untying those knots are tied into it, right? It sounds funny to tie it into it, but how we do that, right? And kind of similar to we saw with the free write, but this time I want you to have like focus on it, like focus on those things, right? So really read through that. It gives you more details. That's just going to be a written response for you guys, and then you'll also complete the discussion All of them are in the modules too. I'm sorry I didn't link it there. I was like, I had just finished filming the video a little while ago. Um, but yeah, so you'll do that as well. Here, let me pull it up real quick. It's called the power of the Yucca Quarter discussion. So you're gonna do the same thing. There's my video. Look, hey, there's me. Discussing what you need to think about and what questions you need to answer. Bueno, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Enjoy the content and thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing and reading your seeing your videos and reading your pieces. Remember, the pieces can be anything. It doesn't have to be a paper. There's no page requirement either. I know some people ask that. Like, it's supposed to be just like you writing. Like, it's not necessarily going to be connected to that at all. All right. So write a poem, write a song. I don't care. Whatever it is, narrative, write a letter. I don't care. Enjoy that time where you get to focus. Bueno, bye.